We've got lots of very interesting people in this room with, I'm sure, millions of questions. I wanted to actually just start, though, with one, and be a bit of an agent provocateur, hopefully. Okay, we're going to continue the navigational metaphors here. Nobody's mentioned anything to do with autonomous or AI. There are such a thing, Jeff and Paul, as autonomous ships. So, in the future, if science advice communicators, those who are interested in science advice and the future of science advice, if they don't up their game in the way that Catherine has just mentioned, are they at risk of being replaced by artificial intelligence, machine learning? Discuss.
Well, yes, I'd imagine that anybody who's got any kind of, you can hear me, can you? No? The AI question is really interesting because I'm sure we'd like to think, I don't think in a face-to-face personal area, if you sort of gave your AI robot, or whatever it might be, in this case it might be a jellyfish, if you gave him or her the ability to digest all the information that scientists might have given, all the areas that go into what makes evidence-informed policy. And as people have pointed out, it's not simply the science, there's all kinds of other areas, whether or not the Flying Association goes for it, the kind of publicity it's getting, the religious aspect, all kinds of areas. If you put all that in and said, okay, give me the best advice you could, I'm sure it could do it. But what would be the end result? Because politics is ultimately about people, and advice to politicians is all about the way you interrelate with people. So you might get good advice, but it'd be like having a robot housekeeper. You still wouldn't want them sort of running the whole place, right? It's still your house or your ship.
So it turns out the CCA has done 2 reports on marine shipping. One of them looked at the risks of marine shipping, and another looked at the social and economic costs. So enough with the metaphoric segue. I want to pick up on something that Catherine said. I'm getting a little bit itchy about this preoccupation with advice as if it were one type of thing. That there's this thing called advice, and you can program robots for it, or you could train people. It turns out that I've also not heard something today so far, and it's sort of couched in the, what do people want and what do they need? And it turns out those are different things. We often use the phrase advice as the answer to the question, what do I need, or what do you need advice? And in fact, there's no shortage of people wanting to tell government that what you need is good advice, and guess what? We're the ones to give it to you, and that's fine and good. I'm not by any means a Luddite on this, but I don't have much hope or optimism for the sort of takeover of all advice-giving activities by machine learning. And the reason is, in much the same way that we think right now, we could convene every meeting by Skype or FaceTime or some other mechanism where people don't have to fly. There is still a value to human interaction. So advice giving is not only about the outcome, it's about the process, and it's about making mistakes and struggling without using a complete algorithm. That said, I think there are certain areas where it's probably a great idea to ensure that you have a comprehensive, deep learning, robotic capacity to ensure, and this is at the high risk end of the scale, that you're not missing things. But in terms of normative judgments, which is a part of advice giving that gets shuffled off to the side, I think we've got a ways to go, and for good reason. I like the question, and I think we should ask it. In one of my former lives, I watched an experiment in the Oxfordshire hospitals in the early 1990s that used essentially bedside computers to predict the outcomes of medical procedures at the end of life. And what was awkward about it was that the computer programming often resulted in a sort of a decision: don't treat this patient, they are guaranteed to die, and it would be fill in the blank, not cost effective to do so. And what that did was not have folks run back and look at the software, but it scared the living you-know-what out of patients in that catchment area that thought a decision about their care, even if it happened to be excellent algorithmically, was seen to be inhumane. So until we get that little thing, glitch, worked out, there's probably still need for all of you new students learning how to give advice.
Yeah, just a quick comment as well. I mean, I agree, obviously. Really just to say that, it's about optimizing an interface between science and public policy, where public policy, from the moment you're saying you're advising, you're giving advice, it's a normative question. And I think we can't lose sight of that. That policy is about values, is about balancing values, about aligning values, sure, to the evidence. But I don't think that, well, I would hope that we're not at risk of becoming a technocracy where it's entirely driven by evidence. And from most recent perspective of mine in New Zealand, we spent a good deal of our time talking about why we say evidence-informed policy and not evidence-based policy. We talked about the interface as opposed to, we talked about optimizing an interface between the two, and spent a lot of time sort of socializing that with the public, but more importantly with policymakers and politicians as well, who themselves perhaps sometimes were at risk of wanting a technocracy.
Janet, did you want to? No? Okay. All right, let's go to the audience. Do we have a roving mic, or how are we handling that part?
Share.
Yeah.
Okay. We have a rover then. We don't have a roving mic, but we have a rover.
Thank you, Beck.
And perhaps maybe just identify yourself before asking your question.
First, thanks to the panel. That's very interesting. I'm Michael Wolfson. We, in the last couple of days, had the publication of the Canada Food Guide. And I think that's an interesting example of the fruits of science advice. And I take from it two kinds of things. Well, there have been several objections or concerns raised. One is, my wife, for example, says, where the heck are the portion sizes? So there's not enough detail there, which raises the question of how do you communicate uncertainty. And the other is the dairy industry and the beef industry are not very happy, and the health minister seems very happy to be saying that this is the first time it's been done without industry. But turn that into a question, which is how does one draw the boundary between science advice and let's call it policy advice? Because I would assume within Health Canada, policy analysts have told the minister and others, the dairy farmers are going to be ticked off, for example. How do you want to leave that? So, general question is, how do you draw the boundary between science and policy advice? And another one is, what do you do? The reason there are no portion sizes in there, I think, is because the evidence wasn't strong enough. So how do you deal with uncertainty in giving the science advice?
Difference between science advice and policy advice. I mean, this is a great guide, and I've been this is my comments about the economy, right? The backbone is the economy being dairy and beef in New Zealand. It would have made some waves. And I think what we probably would have drawn from the well of Roger Filkey on this, and talking about brokerage and about honest brokerage, and to talk about the fact that science advice in this context can provide information on what we know, on what we don't know, and on where that points, but stops short of saying what the policy outcome should be. And translating that to this context, of course, I mean, it's a very contested space, right? But I think that just coming back to that position of an honest broker sort of helps to define that line.
I'll play. And how many more times can we either use water, boats, or the fruits? That was a very nice play. There's several nodding heads, Michael. Well done. So actually, taking a page from the Kinder chapter, which has already been mentioned by Christian, I think it's always good to make sure that we're all talking about the same thing, which I know, Michael, you have already thought of this. And it's first that distinction between the science that is used to inform any policy, energy policy, foreign policy, labor policy, housing policy, what type of, and science is the collective noun for all kinds of evidence, knowledge, information, data, values. It's a whole massive thing. How do we take a bunch of stuff that's meant to inform what would otherwise be seen as or considered a mere opinion or a preference or a whim of a policymaker? That's to be distinct, and that's what I think you're referring to, rather than policy about science, how much money should CIHR get this year, or should we extend the mandate of a particular organization that works in science. The former, I think, is quite interesting for the two reasons that you mentioned. I'm going to repeat them, not to say that I'm doing it to show I understand, but I think you make two really good points, and it's the second one first. Every policy activity is an exercise in managing uncertainty. Every single one. There is no ongoing longitudinal trial that I've ever seen that can prove the point about whether a particular policy was the right one or not. You know, it reminds me of the line from Joanne Lai when asked, what do you think of democracy? And he says, well, it's too early to tell. The same is true about any policy. So if certainty is what you want, advice is not the way that you go. Is not the place that you go to get it. Certainty has to come from some other set of moral or political values, which mean that you are unmoved by anything that will change your view. I refer you to the occupant of the White House right now, who does not seem to be moved by data or evidence other than what he calls his gut. I am no fan of Trump, but 63 million Americans voted for that, and an almost equivalent number, fewer, voted for George Bush the second at 43, when he was famous for saying, things are black and white. I don't want to change my mind. I think that shows strong leadership. So there's a whole bunch of things about what counts as input certainty and decision certainty. I think science does a fabulous job of qualifying input certainty. This is what we know. These are the limitations. We can't be certain. We're not sure. All of those qualifiers. Outcome or decision certainty is a whole other set of values about the individual. As for the first bit, the Canada Food Guide, we could probably spend hours on it as to why it looks like it does, why the change has an effect, an intended effect, whether as opposed to the unintended consequences of a much simpler geometry that has 3 colors and 3 sizes rather than the former one that had 5, I think, little bits for milk. It was quite an interesting aesthetic. But on that front, I am not the least bit surprised that the advice about how to communicate the policy outcome was not based on what the science of the input was. It was based on the expected consequence of the outcome.
We have a few questions over here. If we get the mic moving in that direction.
Thank you very much to the panel and to those who spoke before as well. My name is Peter McKinnon. I've spent much of my career walking the boundaries between the academic community, the public sector policy, and industry and business, and where they intersect and don't intersect. My question is maybe not argent provocateur intended, but tonight I've heard a lot about the past and the present, and in the title we also have the future. So I'm just wondering if the panelists would make some comments about their views on science policy in the future in Canada. And if I may add a component to it, science is clearly, the word has always been used in science advisors and so forth. But where does engineering, or let's call it applied science, fit? Because it's, in effect, a continuum of some sort. And we stop at science, and engineering is a very important part of making things happen. Thank you.
Janet or Catherine, did you want to start on that one and we can move in this direction?
I can't predict the future. I wish I knew how to do that, but in terms of what goes on with engineers, an awful lot of, I think, looking at future, for whatever reason, engineers seem to have a lot to say about that. Like they seem to predict a lot about what's going to be happening. And I'm not sure whether that's because it's the Natural Sciences and Engineering Council that has the funding to do these things. I guess your question is really, I'm not quite sure what the question is as far as what we should be looking for in the future, what we should look to towards advice or science policy, whether it will be still policy, will it be only dealing with pure science, or will there be any room for like big science, which is usually got engineers and everyone involved with it. The big science projects tend to be, you know, the Snow Lab, for example, did very well and things, but it took a while, and I think you've got a number of those big physics projects that are going on. I think they'll continue. I don't think people put the kibosh on them unless it's CERN and they keep on closing down and having to fix it. But, you know, I'm not sure. Again, I think sort of that kind of is a black art trying to figure out what's going on in the future. So I guess I'm not quite sure. All I know is that there's a number of things, incentives in place so that by 2050 this will happen, including climate science. And I think that's the area where I'm hoping that engineers will be able to come through for us, and that is in some kind of climate mitigation. Sorry, I don't think that answered your question.
Yeah, and I'm not going to go to the future.
Okay.
I just quickly to comment on that. It's obviously an interesting question, and I think that in it we need to parse the science for policy, policy for science sides of the sort of the spectrum. And on both of those sides, it's something that I've sort of mused on, not rigorously at all, but thought a lot about, and that's because of the changes that we're seeing in how policy is made in general. So on the science for public policy side of things, one of my random musings has been, is it a thing? Will it be a concrete, you know, tangible sort of you can point to it thing, or will it become more diffuse? So that science now is understood to be so much a part of every policy area that it won't ever need to be a standalone thing, and that you'd see it across the board. That's for the science for public policy. On the other side of the spectrum, policy for the science system, what I wonder about is how much of the sort of new way of policy making is going to creep into those types of decisions. So things like, you know, much more networked policy making, much more horizontal policy making, collective intelligence, open policy making, you know, public input into those decisions about where we put our money for the science system. How much of that sort of new types of policy making generally is going to be imported into this, what has been sort of this very expert and kind of quiet area of policy making. So I'm not answering your question, I'm just posing more, but it's a really interesting, you know, to think about.
So I have seen at least 4 or 5 other questions. I want to make sure that we get to the back of the room where we have the future of science advice in Canada. So we have a couple of questions at the back, a few others, but I'm hopeful that people will understand that we might not be able to get to all of the questions, and that hopefully our panelists will continue to be around for a little bit afterwards and be able to answer some questions. But I absolutely want to make sure that we hear from the folks at the back.
So my name is Bridget McLaughlin, and I'm here with the Science and Policy course. Janet, you made an interesting comment with her.
Oh, close right hands. Okay.
You made an interesting comment about social media and how that input from the public can become noise quite quickly. But I kind of viewed it as, yes, it is noise, but what an enormous sample size of opinion that you can gauge from. So do you guys think that there is a positive way to use social media while informing policy?
Hi, my name is Omar. I'm working to study French at the University of Ottawa. Just to add to that, you brought up an example of how acid rain was being implemented in science policy so quickly because it gained public traction, and everyone was concerned about lakes acidifying. So how do you mediate between Canadians and, say, for example, the anti-vax movement, for example, how that may gain traction and ironically contrasts evidence-based science policy? How do you mediate between movements like that or ideas like that gaining traction by Canadians and the public and the advice that I would assume be given by professionals, which would contrast that? So how do you mediate between those two in terms of science policy?
My name is Mackenzie Finner. I'm also here at the class, but I'm actually studying communications and global studies, so a little bit of a different perspective. Going through, you guys talked about culture of science, cultural advisors, and kind of welfare for everyone. So again, touching on social media, given our multicultural community, our increase of immigration, how do we go about disseminating this information about policy that everyone can kind of understand? Because we talked about the history kind of informing your stance on science. So how do we make sure that the broader population is comprehending and accepting these policies? And how do we use social media to kind of make sure that multiple publics are getting this information? So recently we saw a big uprising about plastic straws and how that was kind of but that kind of started all on social media and was spread a lot farther than I think they were thinking it was going. So should we be aiming to make social media uprisings like the straw movement, or is that not really a strategy that we should be using?
So lots of great questions. We also still have to hear from Paul. So what I'm going to do is ask each of the panelists literally 30 seconds to 45 seconds response, and then Paul, you will wrap it up for us.
I don't know, you guys, I mean, I'm looking to you on the social media. That's a dark art for sure. In terms of changing minds and broadening a message, I think we can learn from past examples. I think getting to children, having it in schools, having it socialized early on, that's how recycling took hold, that's how, these types of movements take hold. I think we have a new tool in social media, but I can't take that any further. I would turn to the media experts and other people in the room. That's what I'm trying to say.
Neither of which are me. Thank you, Jim. I'm actually reminded of Marshall McLuhan at this moment, who obviously said the thing that we all get to repeat, the medium is the message. But he also, in a Playboy interview, believe it or not, in 1968, cautioned about the data banks that are being developed that will control all of us if we're not careful. So on the one hand, not a new topic, new technology, but not a new topic. So I'm rather interested in how one either regulates, in the small r sense, this fantastic new technology for good rather than for the opposite of good. And I would leave it to you to let us know how to do it.
I think that social media can be used for very good purposes and also for very bad purposes. And I look at something like Brexit. First of all, leaving aside the question about whether such an important governance question should have been delegated to a referendum and to people who weren't adequately educated on all the issues that were involved in Brexit. But it really, it's so interesting to see what's going on now in Britain, and there's this whole movement about should it be Parliament or should it be the people, and I don't know how it's going to be resolved in the end, but it's so interesting to watch that. The vaccine issue is equally important. I don't know whether you saw that a young child died, I think in Gatineau, had not been vaccinated, and the mother said that she was definitely going to have her other child vaccinated. And you know, that all happened through social media, and it's a slow education project. And so, for me, it has both positive and negative. You're not going to turn it off, and so it's how it's used. It's how it can be used for good, and how you turn off the bad.
It's a marvelous tool. I'm sure if I took your iPhones away from me, you'd go through withdrawal right now. But part of it is understanding how it was set up so that you are addicted to it in a certain way. And I think as you look at privacy issues that have come out, if you look at people taking Facebook and Twitter and all these through the court system or through their governments and saying, what are you doing? What are you doing with my information? Who told you you could do that? I think people are going to smarten up a little bit. And I mean, there's films coming out about it, there's documentaries, people are sort of thinking, maybe I shouldn't be doing this, maybe it's not so good. And I think that's going to change a way around how you perceive it and how it's used. So yes, it will still be nasty, but also I think you understand a little more about how it can be used for good. And, you know, at times, even, you know, again, the face-to-face you're talking about, get off it, talk to people in person. And the anti-vaxxers is a strange thing because people have always been a little bit leery of vaccination, but this whole cognitive dissonance that I know more than you do, so I'm not getting my kid vaccinated, is sort of been amplified by social media. But I think that again, if more people start getting sick and all of a sudden you're getting these statistics, measles, how on earth did we get measles back again? So that sort of thing is going to make people all of a sudden smart enough, I'm hoping. It's up to you to figure out the rest of it.
Well, this is the easy part of my job, which is to invite all of you to join me in thanking the panel for just a tremendous